first couple of strikes, as you would, as any leader would want, you want to own that responsibility. So I said, I'm going to be the one to make the call after getting all the information and make sure it's the right strike. That was September 2nd. I watched that first strike live. As you can imagine, at the Department of War, we got a lot of things to do. So I didn't stick around for the hour and 2 hours, whatever, where all the sensitive site exploitation digitally occurs. So I moved on to my next meeting. A couple of hours.
At the top of the show, we had Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump at a cabinet meeting. And as anybody who watches those cabinet meetings knows, the whole point of cabinet meetings is not to do business. It's to sit around and generate a lot of publicity, tell Donald Trump what a smart and wonderful person he is, and that the entire United States would be in the toilet if he hadn't been elected in 2024. This is the Lethal Lazy Liars edition. I'm Claire Potter.
Neil Young.
And we're here to talk about all things Pete Hegseth today. But before that, the news summary. So, in a closely watched special election, MAGA Republican Matt Van Epps defeated Afrin Bain, the Democrat, in a race to replace Mark Green, who took a job in the Trump administration. Now, this is Tennessee 07. Van Epps was endorsed by Trump and Bain, a former community organizer, by DSA, and Van Epps won by 9 points. But why is this interesting, Neil?
Well, it's interesting because, this is a heavy Trump district. Just a year ago, Trump won by 22 points. Obviously, Bain did a lot of work here in making it a close, not a close race, but way closer than this district normally is. Also, Democrats won a bigger percentage of the vote in every county in this district, and Bain also won really big in Nashville, the part of the district that actually goes into Nashville. It's been interesting to watch sort of Republicans and Trump administration folks talking about this because, of course, they want to turn this into like the media gets everything wrong, and but they should be panicked that, again, a district that Trump won easily a year ago by double digits, dropped by double digits in terms of a support for a Republican there. And so I think this was probably not a district that anyone really expected Bain to win. And I think Republicans should certainly not see this as good news. It is a Republican victory after a lot of Democratic victories over the last year that we've talked about. But in a lot of ways, I think this is sort of a moral victory for Democrats who, again, are looking at the year ahead and what 2026 might shape up to be.
Yeah, and listeners, just thinking about this over the next year, and there will be more special elections, there will be numerous elections at the state and local level, which we may be watching as well. Part of the point is in 2026 to make Republicans defend counties and districts that they have not had to defend in the past, to make it expensive, to make it chaotic for them. And, one of the interesting things is that not only did Trump win this district by 22 points, as you said, Neil, but Mark Green won it that same year by 24 points, all right? So it also kind of points the finger at the number of talented congressmen that the Trump administration insisted on removing from Mike Johnson's majority and placing in the administration. They haven't done such a good job of replacing those people, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really smart point. And I think, it's been interesting to see the folks that Trump has called up into the administration that seems like a sort of short-sighted plan, as you've just said, and then not having like a real strategy about what that means for seats that come up. And I think just sort of the broader vulnerability that like is the case for the party. I think it's a really good point also to think about these districts where the Republicans could take for granted suddenly being, maybe not tight battlefields, but places that they have to put money into and they have to put operations into. And that certainly creates a more complicated ground game for the next year for Republicans.
Absolutely. And just to add a little coda, it's beginning to look like, despite all the hysteria, despite all the criticisms, that the Democratic Party is starting to fire on all six cylinders. If anything has six cylinders anymore, the Democratic Party seems to be firing on them. So I think people can relax a little bit around, what do the Democrats stand for? What are they doing to win back this country? Don't you think, Neil?
Definitely, and I think that's actually a really good point, because think of all the death knells we heard, not
Right.
that long ago about the Democratic Party, and certainly it was a bleak, bleak moment, and I think in a lot of ways the party seemed rudderless, right? And without sort of a clear direction, a clear narrative. I think in a lot of ways, Democrats are benefiting from the chaos and the disorder that the Republican Party and the Trump administration is creating in American life. So we shouldn't necessarily imagine that what this means is the Democrats suddenly have a coherent message that is, resonating with the American people, as much as like this is just a vote of opposition. That said, I think you can also interpret a lot of the results, as we have, that speaks to the strength of the Democratic brand, and also the variability of the Democratic message in different districts and different locations that is resonating with voters. So if it's moderate Democrats in Mississippi and Virginia, and liberal, even social Democrats in places like New York City and Seattle, clearly there's a political spectrum being represented in a way that is not the case for the Republican side. And that political spectrum seems to be, for the most part, something that voters are willing to get behind right now. Again, maybe in just a vote of opposition to the way things are going from current leadership.
Yes, and I want to jump on that vote of opposition thing, because I think one of the things that's really not working for Donald Trump is his insistence that the economy is just splendid, and that anything that's not splendid about it must be Joe Biden's fault, so it doesn't exist, right? And Americans don't have to look very far to see that things aren't splendid. I mean, I think of myself as a relatively well-resourced human being who goes to the grocery store, buys what I want, and comes home and doesn't really think about it. I have noticed over and over and over again since this summer how expensive groceries are.
Yeah, I think, most Americans are watching those things a little bit more closely. And you can blame the past, and I think like every president, for some period of time in their new administration points to, a prior administration and lays some blame there, but it only works so long with voters. And I think especially going into a holiday season, when you are a year into your presidency, it stops with you. And folks don't have the sort of long memory that I think, someone like Trump does, or that Trump tries to create for people, and tying it back to Biden over and over. At the end of the day, the economy isn't strong. People know it, the people feel it, and people, I think, are all the more mindful of it in a holiday season in which spending is front and center. And so I think none of this looks good for him. And certainly the message of blame isn't something that actually makes a difference in people's lives either, which I think is an important part of this too. That's not a message that people
Right.
changes their lives measurably, and something that they can get behind, because they want it fixed. They want it better.
Yeah, they want it fixed, they want it better. And in fact, your average American doesn't understand the economy writ large any better than Donald Trump does. And so it's worth saying that what a family sees in front of it is the economy.
Right.
And you can tell them something different. You can even be telling them the truth, like the stock market is booming. That makes no difference to the 60% of Americans who own no equities whatsoever. It's really difficult to keep gaslighting people, particularly since it seems that people are less attached to party and much more attached to self-interest, and they are willing to whipsaw back and forth in the absence of getting an argument as to why they shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in other bad news, this week for the first time since 1988, the Trump administration declined to commemorate World AIDS Day, which I just want to say is mean and small and screwed up. The State Department issued a statement saying that an awareness day is not a strategy, but it's also true that they don't have a strategy either, right, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they've cut almost all funding for domestic AIDS prevention. Programs aimed at developing a vaccine for the HIV virus have been eliminated. I just want to echo your point that this is just ugliness. This is pure ugliness. And I also think it speaks to I was going to say the latent homophobia, but latent is not even the appropriate word. The homophobia of this administration that imagines AIDS as a disease of gay men, when of course that's not the case at all. But I think if you truly understand HIV AIDS and its current disease patterns and just the nature of the disease in 2025, it just seems to sort of tie into something we've talked about over and over again, which is the broad assault on LGBTQ folks that this administration is carrying out. I also think it's worth saying, as we talk about a Republican administration, that so much of the good work of the federal government in HIV/AIDS prevention, especially on the global scale, came out of the George W. Bush administration. I mean,
Right.
That's one of the things that I think we can positively credit Bush's presidency for having done. Commitment to increasing HIV/AIDS funding. Gay Republicans played a huge part in that. Read my book to hear more about that. There was a real policy agenda there that I think the Bush administration should get credit for. So this isn't even hasn't been historically a highly partisan issue. But yeah, all of this is ugly and gross. And I think just especially not commemorating a day is, it's just part of their meanness.
It's so mean, and it is also really kind of dovetails with the current administration's libertarian bent, which is if you get sick, if there's something wrong with you, it's really your fault.
Yeah.
Because you shouldn't need to get vaccinated, because if you were really in good health, you wouldn't get COVID in the first place. Or if you did get COVID, you wouldn't die from it. You shouldn't need any kind of coverage for AIDS because you shouldn't be having the kind of sex that gives you AIDS. Sectioning off what we know is that AIDS is heterosexually transmissible. It is transmissible through drug use. It is transmissible through a range of ways. But I think you're right to associate it with the homophobia. I would also say, and I'm really interested in what you think of this, Neil, because you are the religion expert on this podcast, which is it really shows a shift in the quality of the Christianity that is informing the presidency.
Yeah.
When we had George W. Bush, we had a kind of, to refer back to his father, George H.W., compassionate conservatism. That Christianity meant helping people. And that was, in fact, the approach. And one of the reasons the Bush administration was so effective in places like Africa is that it utilized already existing networks of evangelicals to make sure that the drugs were distributed and taken properly, and that strategies were developed within communities, which missionaries actually knew how to do. It's a very, very big deal. But we're seeing a really different kind of Christianity informing the Trump administration. It's punitive. It's an Old Testament mean God, right?
Totally, yeah. To add to the compassionate conservatism of George W. Bush, I would also say there was this notion of the servant's heart, or servant leaders, which was very big in evangelical culture and the late news and the thousands around the George W. Bush administration. And this notion, I mean, it was highly patriarchal, and there was a lot of I think sort of, it was problematic in itself in a lot of ways, but also it generated a sense of white evangelicalism that was sort of community oriented, sort of servant driven, servant leadership driven, outwardly focused. All of that again was in service of spreading the Christian gospel as they understood it. But I think shaped a sort of humanitarian politics that has almost entirely disappeared. And I think the Obama years really scrambled a lot of that spirit and redirected it into the sort of punitive path that you've mentioned, one that is very vengeful, one that has a oversized sense of grievance and of offense, and that the way to handle that is through a raw assertion of power and punishment on any sort of on really others. And that it's not just punitive, it's also really miserly, right? Like everything is being withdrawn from the public square. The only sort of, and we'll get into this more, I think, in our discussion about Hegseth, but just a really sort of vicious display of sort of a religious superiority and sort of religious judgment.
Yeah, hard agree on that one. And also thinking about that religious judgment in relation to different models of masculinity. And I don't want to spend too much amount of time on this here because we're going to be getting back to masculinity when we get to our news focus on Pete Hegseth. But it seems to me that under the George W. Bush model, there was a kind of provider protector model of masculinity, whereas in the Trump administration, it is brutality, violence. You assert your masculinity by harming others, right?
Completely. I mean, again, another sort of very popular notion, and it was driven by this huge bestseller book called Wild at Heart, which was sort of like, I don't remember what the subtitle was, but it was something along the lines of like, evangelical manhood and a modern America or something like that. But this was a huge bestseller, and it had, again, this sort of like benevolent patriarchal notion of what men should be, like caretakers, guardians. And again, a lot of it like obviously very conservative, but in a way that I think like upholds a lot of virtues that like non-conservatives, non-evangelicals would admire, like the man as provider, the man as guardian and caretaker, the man as sort of community servant and community caretaker, the man as sort of a pillar of society through his goodness and through his own self-denial and his own sacrifice, right? Sacrifice for family, for community, for nation. Again, that sort of spirit has been replaced by this sort of vengeful model of like brute masculinity, of anything that's like a limitation on what he wants to do is sort of some sort of like feminist assault on men. And so therefore they should be able to do anything and everything they want. Again, I think we see a great example of this in the person we're about to spend a lot of time talking about. But like a masculinity that is about brutishness and violence and unchecked power has really become what's held up as like a God-ordained sense of what men are supposed to be.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, in our next news item, one of the things we're seeing in Congress, and, we were tracking this story before with Marjorie Taylor Greene, but a lot of very high profile MAGA women who are rebelling against Speaker Mike Johnson's leadership. And that was kind of a big story this week, that Johnson is kind of on the ropes. He seems to be holding on to his speakership by a thread in the face of criticism from his caucus. Johnson's critics now include Elise Stefanik, who, of course, is not running for Congress again in New York 21 because she is running for governor. But Stefanik had very, very, very harsh words for Mike Johnson this week. What did she have to say, Neil?
Well, she's saying that, like, he's a liar. She's accused him of lying, of getting rolled by Democrats. Like, the Democrats are playing him and he doesn't know how to, like, handle his party. And I think she's right. He doesn't really seem to be a good leader here in terms of, like, managing the caucus. And, and this, of course, builds upon things that like Marjorie Taylor Greene has said about Johnson and other Republican women have said. And so there's a lot of like disgruntled Republican women in this caucus. And, I saw on Twitter something, or maybe on Instagram, someone saying something to the effect of like all these Republican women who are bristling at Johnson and sort of MAGA leadership in general. And it's like, them discovering feminism is just, example 1 million of like adopting progressive values when they're personally affected. And I think like that seems really accurate analysis to me.
Yeah, and it also shows that there are two problems I'm looking at here. One is the problem of Christian leadership when you take it out of the family and put it in Congress, right? Because a lot of these women, let's add Nancy Mace to the group, let's add Lauren Boebert to the group, they're all Christian. They are all evangelicals of one kind or another. They don't appreciate being treated as less than, and that is what they have explicitly said. that it's lousy to be a woman in today's Republican Party. And I have seen people speculate on this connection, like how, in fact, can Mike Johnson believe in that patriarchal model of male leadership that is given to men by God, and then give women any authority in his caucus or actually even treat them seriously. I'm sure there's ways that that happens in churches, and maybe you could tell our listeners what that is. How does it work out on the ground in a church and Congress doesn't actually make room for a more nuanced dynamic?
Well, I think the way it works out on the ground in a church is that there's roles. There's roles you play, and you're in this area of leadership, which is usually children's ministry, maybe sometimes music, but like in no position that puts you in authority over men. I mean, that's in the sort of conservative evangelical structure. And so like that doesn't translate to Congress or to the workplace either, right? Like, you know, where you're like, well, you can only be in charge of these things, or you can only have this title. I mean, they're all representatives. They all have the same exact job title and job function. I mean, I think like obviously this works sort of structurally and culturally in terms of like who gets leadership positions and who gets named to committees and things like that, where that can play out a little bit. It can be shaped by ideas about gender and power and all the rest, but like these are just two very different systems. And so I think that like you can't bring over those ideas about gender and power and organization into a place that like operates by entirely different rules, logics, norms, but also like is a place that's still being shaped by those ideas of patriarchy, of power, of gender, and all the rest that, you know, these folks like spend, you know, the majority of their time in.
Yeah. And, you know, just listening to you, Neil, I think there's something we may be getting to here about gender equality and how certain kinds of agendas like the anti-trans agenda, anti-gay agenda are actually coming out of this Christian model of male dominance. Because, of course, you're right. Everybody in Congress, everyone in the Senate is equal. Everybody in the cabinet is actually equal. And then, you know, when we look at our target for today, Pete Hegseth, you know, he has repeatedly said throughout his career that he doesn't believe women belong in operational roles in the military, that they are not suited for them, they cannot compete with men successfully, and therefore they cannot be trusted with those operational roles. And it makes me think of back in the 1970s when women were not allowed to fly fighter jets because of their menstrual periods, that their bodies changed so dramatically during their menstrual periods that, you know, if you had a mission during your menstrual period, you might not be able to fulfill it, or you might like get suddenly really angry and send off a missile when you didn't mean to or something. So this idea that women are sort of flighty and irrational and delicate and that they ought to be that way, that's God's plan, is really kind of foxing the capacity to hold the House majority together, right?
Yes, I think that like there's a lot at work here, sort of culturally and politically. I think what's going to be interesting to see is just like how this story develops. Like, what are these women like? What's their larger project that they're carrying out here? Is this a way of like getting Johnson in line? Like, I don't necessarily, I mean, I can understand their grievance and like, I think the things they're saying are probably very accurate, but like, what is the resolution for this in their minds? Is it a toppling of like conservative ideas about gender? Probably not. And yet, like, that's what's driving this. So like, what's the resolution here?
Yeah. You know, I'd also like to just sort of drop into this conversation. One of the things that has occurred to me is that because the MAGA Republican Party is so contemptuous of authority, period. I mean, you know, I read a story today about John Thune that said John Thune is actually having a lot of trouble in his leader role in the Senate as well. And, you know, if in fact your party says over and over and over again, elites lie, make your own decisions, do your own research, I mean, you're basically setting yourself up for having a congressional majority and a Senate majority in which everybody kind of does their own thing and can't be counted on in the end, right?
Yes, because ultimately the philosophy is anarchy, right? I mean, and so that's great in spirit, that's great in idea, but like when you translate that actual like animating politics into like a workplace that has to function and that relies on things like structure, hierarchy, leadership, and all the rest, as any, organization would, let alone Congress that's designed actually for that, this is what you get. But like, this is the politics that has actually animated this party and has like put it in the position of power that it's in. But it's a snake eating its tail, essentially.
Yeah, no, totally agree. So let's move on to healthcare ever so briefly, because this may be on a lot of listeners' minds right now. They may be looking at their proposed payments for their health care next year, their health insurance, and sort of trying to catch their breath. Republicans said they would try to solve the problem, and some Republicans seem to be sort of caucusing and trying to put together certain kinds of plans. Democrats are now circulating a discharge petition to renew existing health insurance subsidies under the ACA for 3 years, which would take them through the Trump administration and into the next administration. But Republicans are struggling to agree on how to respond to this hole that they basically dug for themselves. All they had to do was continue the subsidies. If they wanted to propose another plan, they could have done it next year. But now we've got another discharge petition, and it's beginning to look like that's how the Democrats are planning to operate, because all they have to do is peel off 3 or 4 Republicans and they bring it to the floor for a vote. So what's going to happen if this problem is not solved by January, Neil?
Well, a lot of people are going to lose their insurance, right? Like there's a new poll out that shows a quarter of those who are now insured through the ACA would drop their insurance completely. So that's catastrophic for probably millions of Americans. About half of them say it would affect how or even whether they would vote in the midterm elections, which I think is actually sort of fascinating. You would think if anything, it might mobilize them to be more politically engaged. But I also think it speaks to what the poll also found, which is that basically, people in this position have very little faith that politicians of either party are able to solve this problem. Although it does show that they're more critical of Republicans than Democrats. So I think like there is an opportunity here politically for Democrats to like seize on this issue and really, front load it for messaging for the coming year. Yep. To tie it to Republicans. I mean, they've already done so fairly well over the past couple of months with, the government shutdown and whatever. But I think this should be an issue that Democrats can message successfully and I think win. But we'll see how those numbers shift. But like, it isn't surprising that Americans most affected by this very scenario don't feel all that politically engaged because they feel like politicians writ large are the problem here. And they're not entirely wrong.
No, they're not entirely wrong. And I think, one of the big downsides for Republicans of having made absolutely everything political, from our bathrooms to the food we eat to our vaccines and so on, is that it drives a kind of disgust with politics when legislators are not doing their job. And I think a lot of Republican congresspeople know that. I think there are a lot of Republican congresspeople who are in sort of purplish districts or who are watching what went down in Tennessee 7 and sort of saying, guys, you can gerrymander as many states as you want, but my constituents are angry and upset, and you are making their lives dramatically less affordable. They will be sicker. And of course, we're already seeing illness on the rise, serious illness that was more or less eliminated because of RFK Jr.'s vaccine agenda. So I think there is a big opening for Democrats here. I would also like to say Democrats have consistently said to Americans, we want you to have health care. They haven't always been great on producing the system that is going to get health care for everyone, but it has always been a positive vision and one that has been tied to growing the pie of who is included. Republicans have done just the opposite, which is partly why they have no policy to offer. Okay, so let's get to our boy, Pete Hegseth. So Pete Hegseth is really on the griddle this week because of a new investigation into strikes on Venezuelan fishing boats that he and President Trump claim are carrying drugs to the United States. We have not seen the evidence that they are carrying drugs to the United States. I'm willing to have an open mind about this, but as many people have mentioned, in the United States, when you know somebody's dealing drugs, you don't send a missile into their apartment. You go and arrest them and you try them. And, there are lots of problems with this approach, but are we surprised that Pete Hegseth has ended up in this position, Neil?
Not at all. I mean, I think he's sort of everything he's said in his nomination period as secretary has indicated like this is the type of military philosophy he has. And this is also sort of like the poor decision-making qualities he has. And I think that's true not only in this position, but we see throughout his career and his own personal life. This feels very consistent with what we know about him and what he's shown us over time. It's also, I think, pretty consistent with Trump's own ideas about like how issues are handled and the sort of like just punch them in the face type approach to anything and everything. So, it's not surprising for Hegseth. I think what's important here is like military strategists and military analysts who are saying like, this is not reminding us and reasserting that this is not how things are done. This is not how we carry out things strategically for a whole host of reasons.
Right. And, and we don't carry things out like this strategically in part because actually, even though Donald Trump has said he is at war with drug cartels coming out of Venezuela, and it's very unclear what that means because they're always designating people terrorists, and then you say, well, why are they a terrorist? And they're, well, because I say they're a terrorist, right? So he veers back and forth between saying, are they terrorists? Are they drug traffickers, which are actually, in terms of international law, two entirely different categories of people that suggest two entirely different kinds of approaches. But one of the things that has been coming up in this is the question of, are these war crimes? Which begs the question, are we at war? And the answer is no. And some people in Congress have been working on that. And we know Trump actually is sort of toying with the idea of going to war with Venezuela. The other thing, Neil, that I think you're sort of pointing to, which I was listening to a conversation in NPR about this the other day, is that what the United States does to let's just assume these Venezuelan fisher people are combatants. What the United States does to other nations' combatants are the things they do to us. So what was particularly at issue in this week's news with Hegseth was the so-called double tap on September 2nd, in which a Navy airplane jet fired a missile into one of these boats. The boat burst into flames, it capsized, there were 2 survivors, and the order was given, we're not sure who gave the order was given to kill them too in the water. If you are at war, you don't do this. This is against the laws of war. And as somebody was pointing out on NPR, what would the United States do if our seamen were in the water trying to save their lives, had no possibility of attacking back, and a Chinese plane came in and took them out?
Right.
So where are we going with this? Is this going to be, and we should talk a little bit about who Hegseth is and how he ended up in this place, but is this going to be the thing that takes him down?
It seems pretty bad, and I think, Republicans in Congress are saying, not all of them, but there seems to be a sort of a growing chorus of folks that are not happy about this, and particularly, having seen the video, there's a lot of them that are like really concerned with this. I mean, you don't do this because of what you just said. You don't want American service persons to be treated to treated the same way in their engagements, and so there's a real danger in opening the door to this in terms of just like what this means for military action and violence, around the world that American troops could be subject to. So I don't know if Hegseth survives this. Trump seems to like him so far, and I think in part Trump likes him because of the way that Hegseth operates, the sort of, pound your chest, like bravura, the attacks on media. I mean, I think like the opening clip that we shared at the top of the show is actually really worth watching, not just listening to, because there's this moment, I don't know if you spotted this, Claire, when, Hegseth is just sort of scrambling for an answer in response to a reporter's question, and like halfway through, he turns it and it becomes about attacking the media and like turning this back on you journalists who sit in your air conditioner. You don't know anything about, the fog of war, which of course is not like, it's just like mumbo jumbo, but also mumbo jumbo that is in the tried and true Trump, discourse of like attack the media. And Trump literally like becomes completely engaged. I mean, he's like all these stories about Trump barely staying awake in these meetings, like he's barely paying attention. And all of a sudden when Hegseth starts turning into an attack on media, like literally new life is given to Trump. He like sits up in his chair, he starts smiling, like this is what animates and like engages Trump. And so Hegseth knows how to operate in a way that like I think keeps him in good standing with Trump, but we also know Trump can turn on anybody at any moment. So who knows how this plays out.
No, that's absolutely right. And, just speaking to what you were saying about what animates Trump and that Hegseth has a talent for zhuzhing him up, I will admit, reading Olivia Nuzzi's Nuzzi.
Ugh, why? Claire.
And, well, there's some stuff in there where she shows some real insight into this guy. And she says that, too, that actually most of the time Trump is incredibly bored.
Yep.
And that the people he likes are the people who do something interesting, who provide an entertainment, who put on a show for him. And those are the people he takes seriously. All right, so let's go back to Pistol Pete Hegseth, who was a controversial nominee for Secretary of Defense in the first place. There were reports of financial mismanagement in earlier jobs. There was at least one credible report of sexual assault. He had an unresolved alcohol addiction. All of these things came into the nomination process, and he barely squeezed through. There were 3 Republicans who voted against him, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and somebody else. And so J.D. Vance had to get off his fat fanny and come to the Hill and cast a tie-breaking vote to get Pete in. That wasn't a great start. Who was he before he came to this nomination? I mean, it's a relatively short trajectory he's had from college to Secretary of Defense. He's except for like one other, I think, Donald Rumsfeld. He's the youngest Secretary of Defense ever. So who was he? What did he bring to this other than a lot of really bad news?
I mean, he was a Fox News personality. And of course, that's why, he was on Trump's radar to begin with. And, why he'd be the type of person that Trump would pick for this. I think he started off as like a weekend talking head and maybe rose to a little bit more prominence on Fox News. He's written a bunch of books that are like these, culture war grievance books that do really well in conservative publishing. He's been married a lot of times. He's on his 3rd wife at the age of 45. He has a bunch of different kids by all those different wives. He has a terrible history there that's, I think, fairly documented. His 2nd wife was said to have requested aid for spousal abuse on like several occasions. He's also known to have had like a very bad relationship with alcohol, habitually drinking to the point of passing out. Like there's been family interventions around this. That's all been pretty public record stuff. Also a military veteran with 2 Bronze Stars. He went to Princeton. He played basketball at actually, he didn't play, apparently. I just read this article but he was a basketball recruit and sort of a bench warmer there. Also, he was very involved in the conservative publication at Princeton called the Princeton Tory, and has I was reading this article from the Princeton Alumni magazine talking about sort of a Hegseth as a Princeton undergraduate, and didn't have a, notable academic or athletic record, but was a big sort of campus figure and sort of, being this mouth for like anti-woke politics at, Princeton, which of course, works well in the media career he pursued. What else should we know about him?
Well, just from what you were saying there, Neil, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me is that there was all of this stuff bubbling up when you and I were like 25 years younger. I know it's hard to imagine we were ever 25 years younger because we are so youthful right now. But when we were 25 years younger, people like Pete Hegseth seemed like they were on the fringe. Like they were not people you took terribly seriously. And possibly that's what motivated them. But it's, all of these people seem to have congealed in this second administration. People who never got a college degree. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that they are often in positions where actually a little education might have helped them, like maybe going to law school or even getting a BA or something like that. And then someone like Hegseth, who seems to have been kind of a horrible person all along, and then he sort of directed that into a patriotic mission. So it's really like 9/11 that motivates him to become involved with the military, right?
Yeah, and I think also what's useful to think about here and to bring into the conversation is his self-avowed Christian nationalist
Right.
theology and politics. He belongs to this really deeply conservative and really, really small but influential denomination called Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. This is out of Idaho, this man named Douglas Wilson that folks may have heard about, who presides over a pretty small denomination, but one that has often gotten itself in the news for its level of influence, right, around people who really matter, including Hegseth, but having conservative doesn't even seem the right word, but sort of reactionary ideas, especially about women. Douglas Wilson has said that women shouldn't vote, and Hegseth has reposted a lot of Douglas Wilson's, sermons and video clips and all the rest. And I think that's also tied to a sort of obsession that Hegseth has with Islam and this notion that Islam represents the greatest threat to the US and to Christianity around the world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And to his really zealous investment in the Trump anti-woke strategies, the expulsion of transgender service people. And he says he's doing it not because they're transgender, but because they're obviously insane, because they believe themselves to be another gender other than the one they were given at birth. And he wants to ideally eliminate women from combat roles, which is something that he promoted before he became Secretary of Defense. He then recanted it in his Senate hearings, but then he sort of put all this garbage out there about how, women can get through to these combat roles without doing the same things men can. And it's just not true. It's not true at all. And numerous people from the military have stepped forward to say that. And he hasn't exactly reinstituted a ban on lesbian and gay service people, but he certainly has reduced their visibility within the service. He has eliminated the celebration of lesbian and gay soldiers. And my favorite one was characterizing LGBTQ troops serving openly as part of a Marxist agenda. And I want to know, I don't know if you've read any more Marx than I have, but where did Marx say that lesbian and gay people ought to serve in the military?
Right. Yeah. Marx, always wanting to focus on shoring up national security through expanding involvement in military regimes. Yeah. Famous part of Das Kapital.
Probably when he was hanging out in the men's room at the British Library. But, I would also say this is this is all done in the name of increased lethality and effectiveness.
Right.
In other words, the whole point of the American military is to go and kill people into submission, which is actually a really wacky idea about what the military is supposed to do, and radically different from, say, a Reagan-era vision that said, we want the most powerful military in the world, so nobody will ever do anything without our permission. It's a very, very different vision. But what has this done in terms of Black officers, female officers? We know trans people have been expelled, but what have these policies actually, what effect have they had on people's real lives?
Well, they've driven a lot of those folks out of the military, right?
Yeah.
People are either being expelled because of some sort of made up violation, or they're quitting on their own, which obviously is the point of a lot of this. But Black men, a lot of them are resigning because there's this policy now from Hegseth that bans beards, and a lot of Black men can develop a really painful skin condition from shaving. So that's, why they keep a beard. And Muslim soldiers are also wear beards for religious reasons. So there's a way that these policies are actually part of a concerted attack on the diversity of the military. And of course, we know as historians that the U.S. military over the 20th century has been one of the best examples of diversity and obviously there was a long, complicated history there as well of the ways in which the military was long of a agency and a force of exclusion, but the transformation over the 20th century really served as a model in so many ways for the nation. And Hegseth is launching a direct attack at that very history.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I just want to underline that point. I think the American military is perhaps one of the greatest institutions for upward mobility. And you see people talking about it today. I mean, single mothers will say, I joined the military because I want my child to have a better life. My child was born on public assistance. I don't want to live that way. And so people see the military as a place where you can learn important skills, where you can learn certain kinds of discipline, where you can gain financial literacy, where you can gain access to the education that you might not otherwise have access to, either because of where you were born or who you are or not having any money. I mean, I knew a fair number of people at Yale in my class who came to Yale on scholarship and then joined the military so that they could go to medical school. Mm-hmm. And they served in the military for 10 years as doctors and so on, and then graduated into private practice. So the military serves really important roles for a range of Americans. And what Hegseth seems to understand about the military almost exclusively, and maybe this is because most of the time he was in the military, he was going back and forth to Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. But what he seems to understand about it is violence and force. So he's promoted the return of hazing, bullying, and harassment as part of the training process in the military. Why was that eliminated in the first place, Neil?
Well, because people were seriously hurt.
Right.
And worse. And there was a lot of there were a lot of lawsuits over that, understandably so. I think a lot of military leaders also didn't think that those things in any way strengthened and made the U.S. military better. If anything, it undermined things like unit cohesion, competence in the battlefield, and all the rest. That these were actually undermining of military operations and military strategy. And so that's why you don't have them there. You don't want a culture that breeds this sort of chaos and chaos, this sort of chaos and this, undermining of order. And so I just think this is such a telling example. There's a lot of different things happening here, but this particular one just sort of speaks to what I think we were talking about at the top of the show, the sort of new ideas and the new version of masculinity that's really becoming dominant and mainstream throughout conservative culture right now, of this frat boy excess and this sort of lawless, no checks on male aggression that's being held up in general in the context of military culture and military operations. It's a telling one for, I think, sort of a broader foreign policy position and also a broader military strategy globally.
Right. I think that's right. And, also what it does is render any criticism of this approach to the military as effeminate and weak. Yeah. And a vulnerability, making the country unpatriotically vulnerable to other nations. This may seem like a stretch to some of our listeners, but I think it's really significant that this week Hegseth has also announced that his department will sever all ties with Scouting America, formerly Boy Scouts of America, which he claims promotes DEI, and he also claims it's not a boy-friendly space anymore. And he's very ambiguous about what that means, but I think it means that you're allowed to be gay in the Scouts and that there are girls in the Scouts. Now, Scouting America admitting girls has actually had the most deleterious effect on Girl Scouts of America, which has seen a substantial drop in girls that want to be part of that. Neil, were you a scout? You seem so scouty.
I was a Cub Scout for like a couple of years, but I quit before we went into the Boy Scout thing. It wasn't that popular actually where I grew up, which is sort of surprising given what a conservative community I grew up in, but it wasn't as popular. But yeah, I had the cute little Cub Scout outfit for a couple of years. I got a bunch of the badges. I really loved the Derby, the Pinewood Derby. That was the best part of it.
What was that?
Oh, it's when you like carve out a race car out of like this block of pine wood, and then you send it down a ramp, and if you win, if yours comes, I mean, like my wheels like barely stayed on mine, so I was not a future engineer nor a future race car driver, but it was a lot of fun. But
you got the badge for training the most obedient dogs.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. having the neatest bedroom.
Back to the Boy Scouts. What seems unusual to me about this, and I think others have commented on it, is that actually the American military has no formal ties to the Scouts. Yeah. The Scouts have always been this kind of parallel organization intended to raise upstanding boys who might then become soldiers or who might be prepared for military training. And in many ways, Scouting became a substitute for universal military training, which had periodic upsurges of enthusiasm from the 80s on, mostly because of Theodore Roosevelt. But a fair number of Scouts, my own father included, did go into the military, did go into the CIA, did go into the FBI. And so the Scouts have, in fact, been a training ground for certain kinds of ideals they weren't about being a boy. They were about being honorable and good and decent and patriotic, right?
Yeah, about duty, about patriotism, about honor, virtues, not sort of the vices of violence, of aggression, of like unchecked male power. That seems to be what Hegseth think is, what a man is and also how the military should be run. There's a lot happening here, but I think that like one of the things that's just really resonating for me as we think about this whole conversation we've had is just, again, this huge cultural shift around ideas of men and masculinity, which also means, huge attitudes, huge cultural shifts around women and just gender. And I think just to tie it back again to Hegseth's religious beliefs, one of the things we didn't really talk about was the sort of notion of complementarianism. That's like really, really a huge part of the theology that he subscribes to, which is that like men and women are like fundamentally different. And they're fundamentally different because they were created by God to have absolutely different roles in society. And within a family and within like, different structures and different organizations. And obviously that has real bearing on ideas about women in combat and women in the military in general. And so I don't know. I think like, I don't want to, there's versions of complementarianism that are just like hard edged, right? That aren't as like about holding up men as sort of like vicious, violent, vengeful folks. But like, he's clearly of the stripe that like, that's his notion of like, of who men are, of what masculinity is and how a military should operate. And I think this, as many military analysts have point out this and foreign strategy experts point out, a lot of these ideas and a lot of these strategies really make the American military vulnerable and actually undermine national security, which is the scary part of this.
Yeah. And, I wouldn't overrate the role of virtue on the battlefield, but I do think virtue is one of those things that gives people something to hang on to when they are in the midst of moral chaos, when terrible things are happening around them, to be able to come back to a core set of values that says, this is why I'm a human being. Forget this is why I'm a patriot. This is why I'm a human being. And this is how I'm going to get through this terrible thing. So we have a couple of other things on our plate here. One is that on Thursday, Signalgate came back. Pentagon watchdog report concluded that not only did Hegseth violate his own department's policies by discussing a military operation against the Houthis on a Signal app. What was surprising about this incident, Neil?
Well, I think just the lack of, just how dangerous this was and how it's outside of government policy of how this stuff should be done. It's putting American service persons at real risk. Part of the messaging was actually to tell the exact times that attack would take place.
Where we're attacking, this is who is coming to attack them. This is when they'll be there.
The most confidential, the most confidential and classified information you can imagine in such a scenario. And a total disregard for, strategic and security practices that any government official should be adhering to, let alone the Secretary of Defense. And of course, this is now all being spun as a wild media story. Nothing, no intelligence was compromised. No one was made vulnerable, all the rest, but really, really dangerous stuff. And apparently on some of these things, his wife and I think even his brother-in-law was copied. Just real carelessness.
Yeah.
That in any other moment would be the biggest national scandal, but it's just sort of par for the course and just the way things are.
Yeah, and here's something else that's par for the course. The report comes out, it says, yes, absolutely, the Secretary of Defense compromised national security in these ways. Hegseth then tweets, total exoneration. Yep. And then, some reporter asks Caroline Leavitt about it in the next press conference, and she says, I would refer you to Secretary of War Hegseth's, it's just absurd. It's these sort of black is white, white is black. And then somebody said at one point that the Secretary of Defense could declassify things on his own initiative, so that if he was using that Signal app and sending that, it was all declassified because he wouldn't have done it unless it was declassified. So he had already declassified it.
Exactly.
It is crazy making. So in the midst of the crazy, the New York Times has filed a lawsuit that has named numerous administration officials, including Hegseth and Parnell, that the new Department of Defense rules that require journalists to take an oath they will not report anything that has not been approved for release is unconstitutional. Why is it unconstitutional, Neil?
Well, it's a violation of the First Amendment, right?
Hello.
Clearly, the due process of freedom of speech, of freedom of the press, right there in the First Amendment, this seems like an easy case for them. This notion that, reporters would take an oath in order to receive briefings, it's insane. But we shall see how this proceeds. It should be an easy win for them, but who knows these days. It also means that right-wing outlets have completely taken over coverage of this, of this space, because all the normal folks are obviously not willing to do something that's a breach of journalistic ethics, let alone of the First Amendment.
Yeah, my favorite one that's in the room, we've got Gateway Pundit, we've got One American News, we've got Turning Point USA's publication, which is called Frontlines, we've got The Federalist, we've also got Human Events, which has been around since the 90s. I don't know what they do nowadays. But my favorite one is Lindell TV, which is Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy. It's like a YouTube channel. So they are the ones. You would think that the people who are actually at the Pentagon would be beside themselves, in part because actually leaking, talking to reporters, getting stories out there is often a strategy for an administration to float policies and see how they go over. How will experts discuss this? What do the people think? What do lawmakers think? So when you see someone anonymously quoted in the New York Times about something that's going on in the White House, very often that's not a rogue leak. That's a policymaker trying to get something out there to see what other people think about it, or to send a message to Congress that says, no, actually, we're not kicking all the women out of the military. Don't worry about it. But, the press has historically, and Catherine McGarr wrote a great book about this, about the foreign policy press in Washington, D.C. during the Cold War. The foreign policy press in particular has always been this kind of resource for politicians to debate policy with and to learn in ways that you can't learn from polls whether their policies are going to be viable or not.
Yeah, you just keep saying a word that I don't think is really an animating word for the Trump administration, which is policy.
Policy?
So, like,
who needs
you
it?
know, like, if that's not what, like, the majority of the focus is of, like, these different departments and the administration generally, as much as it's, like, grievance politics and, Trump's personal objectives, then you don't need to do that. You don't need the traditional mechanisms of a free press and all the rest.
Well, and this is also, and I'll close this section on this. This is also the place where the Hegseth Trump doctrine, which is strike first, ask questions, and have a conversation later, really makes a difference because it is preempting conversation altogether. Anything that happens after that, you have already exerted your will. You have already done exactly what you wanted to do. You can't take it back. We can't make those 61 Venezuelan people who have been killed by Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump. We can't bring them back. We can't ask them questions about what they were really doing. And so the absence of the press in a situation like that is a real national security problem, from my perspective. So, Neil, what do we want to go viral this week?
What I want to go viral this week is this wonderful article I read in Made by History, which is a vertical in Time magazine that a couple of our friends are the editors of. The piece is called History Shows How Cooking Can Be a Pivotal Tool for Activism. It's written by Bobby Smith II. He's a professor of African American Studies at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. It's a really fascinating history of the role of cooking in the civil rights movement.
Wow.
It's an example of the way in which food production and cooking has often served as an important mechanism for activist movements. But this piece really focuses on this woman who I'd never heard of, but I found absolutely fascinating. Her name is Georgia Gilmore. I was going to say Glenda Gilmore, but that's someone else. Georgia Gilmore. Glenda Gilmore is a very famous historian. This woman, Georgia Gilmore, who was a civil rights activist and a cook in Montgomery, Alabama. She had actually been a cook at a really well-known Montgomery restaurant that was popular with white folks, and she ended up getting fired from that job because of her civil rights activism. This is something that happened to black folks all over the South. They were fired from jobs once their white employers found out they had any involvement in the civil rights movement. But in 1955, she really became connected to the Montgomery bus boycott, and she basically diverted her skills as a cook and a chef to running a kitchen out of her home where she cooked and she sold food to raise funds for the civil rights activism in Montgomery, and really in organizing this whole army of folks who used food production and cooking and running these small sort of kitchens to raise money for the cause. And I just thought it was such a fascinating story about a person I didn't know about. And there's something that the author Bobby Smith II calls in his article. He describes what Gilmore is doing as something that he calls emancipatory food power. And he says, by that I mean the black people weaponizing food at times of social unrest as a way of protecting themselves from oppression. With each pot, cast iron skillet, and cooking utensil, Gilmore exemplified this long-standing tradition in black life, negotiating her identity in America and resisting the ills of racial segregation that pervaded nearly every aspect of her community. So I love this piece. I actually happened to read it. It came out in early November, but I happened to read it like the day of Thanksgiving or the day after. So it felt like a really cool time to be reading about the history of food activism as this, really important aspect of the civil rights movement and of activist history in general. So I really encourage folks to read it. We'll link to it. Again, the piece is called History Shows How Cooking Can Be a Pivotal Tool for Activism.
That sounds wonderful. And I'm going to run off and read it like now, as soon as we hang up. But it also makes me think about the ways that food also played a role in the Black Panther Party, and that the breakfast program for children, that I believe it was Erica Huggins who started it, Erica Huggins, who was also a lesbian, hello, but the breakfast program becomes the template for what we now take for granted, or at least have before the cuts of the Trump administration, that children cannot learn unless they are fed. And so feeding children breakfast becomes an act of resistance against school systems that are simply not meeting not only the cultural and educational needs of Black children, but their physical needs as well. And really making the point that unless children eat, they cannot learn. Unless children learn, they cannot rise above the condition that they're in poor communities. So I think we're going to see a lot more stuff coming up in food history that really ties into the political in exactly the ways you're talking about with this piece. So, Neil, my piece is from Vanity Fair, end of November, and it's by a guy named James Reginato. It's called Oscar Wilde's Only Grandchild Investigates the Atom Bomb of the Oscar Wilde Scandal. Some listeners may know that Oscar Wilde was a playwright, writer, and aesthete in the 1890s. He was bisexual, and in the midst of his greatest triumph, which was a play called The Importance of Being Earnest, which is this very gay play in which people jump in and out of closets and trade identities and so on and so forth. In the midst of this, Wilde ended up in court with the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, who's a young man he was obsessed with and who kind of abused and used him and was horrible to him. But Wilde ends up in court, and he ends up going to prison for violating laws against homosexuality in England. What happened after that is a story very few people know. Many people know that Wilde got out of prison and he died about 3 years later in Paris. What people don't know is that Wilde's wife changed her name and the name of the children. She sent their 2 sons to different boarding schools, and the whole idea was to protect her and the children from the shame of Oscar Wilde's scandal. And so, as it turns out, there is exactly one descendant who is the son of Vivian Holland, the youngest son. And he has written a book. He's in his 70s now. He's written a book that's coming out in the spring. And he talks about what was lost when everybody thought they were doing this for the sons so that they could go on and live honorable lives. But in fact, they lost their beloved father. Wilde's wife continued to love him and was dissuaded from joining him in Paris by her relatives. The children were told he was dead. And so Vivian, the youngest son, gets called into the headmaster's study when Oscar actually does die. And the guy says, "You're going to read about this in the paper, but your father has died." And he is stunned and grief-stricken because there were 3 years in which he could have seen his father, and he didn't. So we talk a lot about generational trauma in terms of big events like the Holocaust and slavery and, all kinds of war and so on. We rarely talk about generational trauma that is very specific to a family and how the lies and errors and mistaken judgments and judgments in general can have ramifications throughout generations. And I'll be very interested to read the book in April, because I didn't even know that Oscar Wilde had a grandchild.
Yeah.
So I recommend this. I would love it to go viral, in part because I'm a huge Oscar Wilde fan. I've always been fascinated, particularly with The Ballad of Reading Gaol that he wrote when he was in prison, coming to terms with what he had done, what was a crime and what wasn't a crime. And actually, in the book, what he is most grief-stricken about is what he did to his wife and children. And they did not know that for decades, which is a huge burden to carry.
I've been wanting to read this article. I actually know the author, James Reginato.
Really?
Well, I mean, not well, but we're friendly and gotten coffee a couple times. And so I've been seeing him, posting this article a lot. And I think it is getting a good amount of attention. And it's It's on one of my open tabs right now, so I'm eager to actually read it, but that was a great overview of it.
Well, when you are in contact with him, tell him I loved it and I thought it was a beautiful piece of writing and really, really important to LGBT history.
Will do.
So, Neil, I think that's it until next week.
All right, sounds good. Hopefully happier topics, but probably not.
And I hope we can both keep our manliness intact until then.
Definitely. Top of the agenda.
Okay, see you next week.
All right, bye-bye.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Imminent Danger by Adam Sabin. You can find his work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.